So thank you for coming to Professor Gilmore's first of three lectures. The next two lectures will be in the Thompson Room. Thank you. The subsequent two lectures will be in the Thompson Room. And we'll have a reception after her first lecture. And to introduce her is the former chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and the coming chair of the Department of History, my dear friend Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. Please give it up for Evelyn.
Well, thank you and welcome to the Huggins Lectures. And we are truly honored today to have 3 days of lectures with Professor Glenda Gilmore, who will speak to us on the topic Romare Bearden, A Life in Art. Professor Gilmore is the Peter V. and C. Van Woodward Professor of History, African American Studies, and American Studies at Yale University, where she has served on the faculty since 1994. Her research and teaching specializations include African American history, gender and race in the South, oral history, and the United States in the late 19th and 20th centuries. She is the author of the award-winning book, Gender and Jim Crow, Women and the Politics of White Supremacy in North Carolina, 1896 to 1920. And this book won the James A. Raleigh Prize of the Organization of American Historians and also the Frederick Jackson Turner Award. Her masterful study, Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights, 1919 to 1950, was designated a notable book of 2008 by the American Library Association and recognized as one of the best books of 2008 by the Washington Post. Her survey, These United States, A Nation in the Making, 1890 to the Present, which she co-authored with Thomas Sugrue, is also a very important textbook and one of my favorites. And I must say, Glenda, I teach all your books, but one of my favorites, Jumping Jim Crow, Southern Politics from the Civil War to Civil Rights, or from Civil War to Civil Rights, which she co-edited with Jane Daly and Brian Simon, is one of the definitive volumes on race in the South. And it's used in many classrooms, as I said, including my own. She's had a distinguished career. She has received numerous fellowships, the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Radcliffe Institute, and the American Council on Learned Societies, among others. And she's also the founder and board chair of the New Haven Oral History Project at Yale, which is a project that teaches students how to interview local residents and to bring their stories into the archive of Yale Sterling Memorial Library. And she is also the past president of the Southern Association for Women Historians. So she has quite an illustrious life in the discipline of history. But I'd like to end with something that moved me reading from her in an op-ed piece this fall. And she was writing about Black football players who knelt during the national anthem. And Glenda Gilmore noted that she understood their protest to be about something more than the flag and something more than a song. And she also referenced Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat, as something more than a ride. And she also talked about the Greensboro sit-ins, which occurred, as something more than buying a milkshake or hamburger. For Gilmore, Black expressions of protests have been about racial discrimination and injustice in this country. And she has devoted her life of learning to expanding our knowledge of the history of legal and social, indeed systemic degradation. She has written about voting rights and education and economic opportunity and, in fact, equal justice for all as a struggle that we celebrate, and we celebrate it in the lives of great and masterful people. But she's always here to remind me that those people and their genius, the genius of these people and singular events, are always part of what she calls the collective and contingent struggles of many people. And thus, I think how appropriate it is to talk about a man who talks about collage through art. And those collage, these images of historical moments and stories come to life as a collective in the artwork of Romare Bearden. And so we're very fortunate today for her first lecture. She will speak to us on Watching the Good Trains, Romare Bearden's Family in Slavery and Freedom, 1832-1915. Let us welcome Glenda Gilmore.
I am delighted to be here. Evelyn knew me when I was a graduate student. I was in my 40s, but nonetheless, I was a graduate student. And thank you so much for having me here. I have this dangerous clicker, and if we get off, I have backup in the back. I want to start with a note on how I'm pronouncing our subject's name. I pronounce Bearden's first name Romare, which is what his family called him, and the pronunciation is derived from the Norman Swedish surname. He's named for someone who it was Swedish, which we'll talk about. One morning in 1915, Romare Bearden's mother, Bessie, awakened him and tousled his blonde curls. The 4-year-old lived with her and his father, Howard, in Charlotte, North Carolina. His great-grandfather, Henry Kennedy, great-grandmother, and grandmother lived next door. Bessie dressed her son in a dress, customary in the 1920s for toddlers in middle and upper-class families. This is Bearden on the right. Romare would soon be breeched and wear short pants, but for now, his mother prolonged his babyhood. With his patent leather Mary Jane shoes and fancy little bonnet, his cousin recalled, quote, he looked like a girl, walking with Bessie up the aisle of the most exclusive African-American Episcopal church in town, where his father, Howard, played the organ. In the main shopping district, Bessie ducked into a store and left Howard outside with Romare. Howard gazed at a window display, turned back, saw the boy straying away, and rushed to scoop him up. As he grabbed Romare, perhaps mistaken for a little blonde, blue-eyed white girl, a group of whites jumped in between them, surrounded Howard, and accused the, quote, black father of kidnapping the white child. Hysteria had gripped Charlotteans as rumors circulated about black people kidnapping white children. A national white slavery panic in 1912 had prompted cities to set up vice commissions to investigate prostitution. White Americans refused to believe that economic desperation could force white women into prostitution, so they spun elaborate stories about villains who seduced and abandoned white girls into sexual slavery. Shortly before the mob surrounded Howard, a vigilant white Charlottean alerted police to a, quote, white child living in a black neighborhood. Police arrested the parents and then released them and returned the child, who, of course, proved to be theirs. These episodes illustrate white supremacist panic overdrawing the color line, even 17 years after Plessy v. Ferguson established segregation as law. Bessie Bearden was lighter-skinned than Howard. Both appeared as M, or MU sometimes, mulatto in the census. The Beardens and their Kennedy family members all designated M in the census. watched as whites inscribed a myth of white racial purity to erase legacies of rapes of enslaved women and to curtail post-emancipation interracial liaisons. White supremacy's political triumph in the 20th century in the South depended on a sexual panic and hypothetical racial purity. Mixed-race people like the Beardens and the Kennedys did not belong in this new world order. Moreover, white supremacy depended on tangible evidence of black inferiority. The white men who surrounded Howard Bearden saw a prosperous, middle-class, confident, mulatto man chasing a white child. For his part, 4-year-old Romare would not have seen danger coming, but he would have heard the shouts, seen the white men grab his father, and felt the fear. Bessie charged out of the store, grabbed her boy, and stalked off. Romary's parents now knew that no degree of middle-class respectability would protect them in the South. White supremacy inflicted a profound psychic wound, the theft of belonging. Belonging conveys a community spirit, feelings of safety, certainty about your place in the world. Romary's life changed forever that morning. Shortly thereafter, his parents moved north. He spent the rest of his life trying to remember that time when he was a beloved child who belonged in Charlotte, living around the corner from the Kennedy grandparents, nestled in safety and basking in love. He called that place and that past, quote, a homeland of my imagination. When asked later in life, do you think it's easier as you've grown older to make use of the past? He cited T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, quote, time is a pattern. You're going back to where you started from with added experience, and you hope for more understanding. As an artist, Bearden's work explored time circularity, revisiting and often reinventing the past. The words memory and remembering fall short of describing the experience that Bearden's art opens up. He did not remember much about Charlotte, the setting of the work that made him famous in the 70s and 80s. After abruptly leaving at the age of 4 in 1915, he returned to Charlotte perhaps only once. Bearden's friend, Ralph Ellison, once described Bearden's work as a telescoping of time. What could Bearden understand in words about his heritage? He knew, as far as I can tell, only these facts. His beloved great-grandfather, Henry Kennedy, was born in 1845 in Chester, South Carolina. Henry Kennedy's mother was named Geraldine Oates. In 1863, in Augusta, Georgia, Henry married Charleston-born Rosa Catherine Gosprey. Henry and Rosa had been servants, quote, as they always said, to President Woodrow Wilson's father. In the early 1870s, they moved to Charlotte. Bearden could recuperate those facts from the material that Henry Kennedy left for him. Tellingly, he did not think that Henry Kennedy and Rosa Gosprey had been enslaved. He was once asked about this. He said, Rosa was considered a Cherokee Indian. Whether she was or not, I don't know. He thought perhaps, quote, maybe his father, Henry's, or hers, Rosa's, were slaves. But I was too young to get into a discussion of that. But as a child at Kennedy's knee, he heard and forgot stories before he had the words to process them as memories. They conjured visions. Visual recall, a part of memory, rarely flows smoothly in the channels that words excavate. When after 1964, Bearden turned to memory to render a visual narrative of his early life, he teetered on the verge of making a coherent narrative. Ralph Ellison understood that art gives us more than memory, even more than history. He said that Bearden's collages, quote, revealed one of the ways for getting at many complex matters that we experience, because art is the mystery that gets left out of history. Artistically, the very wispiness of his recall inspired Bearden. He explained, quote, "The memories are just there. They're just really with me. It's strange. Sometimes," he conceded, "you have to surrender something. But often enough, if you stayed with it," he said, "it finally comes through on canvas." He understood his work to be like that of Edouard Manet, who said, "A painting isn't finished. Sometimes you get on the surface." Family was a recurring theme in his work, and he named at least 5 works either family or the family, but they're not all his family. 2 years before his death, he produced this collage of Rosa Gosprey Kennedy and Henry Kennedy holding him as a baby. His parents look on proudly. This is a false memory, as I'll discuss tomorrow, but it's a beautiful one. Yet, the danger of taking Bearden's work as autobiographical is illustrated by another iteration named Family, this one from 1971. This family comes 6 years after Bearden formed a black arts collective named Spiral, and after the civil rights movement's classical phase. Rather than an autobiographical statement, I believe that Family may be Bearden's response to Daniel Moynihan's report entitled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, which called black family life, quote, "a tangle of pathology because of female-headed households." Here, the Madonna figure is a black man who awkwardly holds a baby with one fist clenched. He is featureless, depersonified, turned into a caricature by Moynihan, and unable to face the mother who looks at him accusingly. One hand also clenched in a fist, and the other bearing a wedding ring. Another child clings to her skirts, and the grandmother holds a baby. In case we miss the point, Bearden hung a dead duck up in the upper left. His rectangular technique, developed from Cubism, which he studied, structures the collage. The characteristic open window, the implied door, the strip of carpet. And yet, a wisp of memory, actual memory, beams through the window. This is actually the view that he had from the window of the Kennedys' home. While critics have read this portrayal, Family, as evidence of his rural roots, I think it was social commentary. Oddly wordless in the face of his artistic production, Bearden rarely countered critics' interpretation of his work. Often he didn't even name a piece until after it was finished. Once, trying to explain this to an interviewer, he recounted Henri Matisse's advice to young artists: "Now the first thing I want you to do is cut out your tongues." Bearden argued, quote, "This way of thinking is not verbalization. Instead, his senses recalled, and this sensory recall became more accessible to him as he grew older. Sensory recall, an image, a smell, a sound, may connect us directly to memory. As Proust would remind us, when memory uses language to narrate experience, those words are a step away from what happened. And of course, writers struggle with words' inadequacy to convey images. The Irish author Colm Tóibín despaired, quote, "My eye, solitary, filled with its own history, deciding for days to forget about words, to know at last that the words for colors, the blue, gray, green of the sea, the whiteness of the waves, words will not work against the fullness of watching the rich chaos they yield and carry." Bearden's creative spirit was often wordless, but never silent. Similarly, recovering the history of his family, or of any family with enslaved ancestors, leaves aching silences unless you're Skip Gates. Bearden opted for collage to record fragments of his visual memory. Nonetheless, historians must use words to recover the history of his family, a history denied to Bearden. And his art shapes the retelling that I'll do over the next 3 days. For example, this collage is geographically literal. This is the Sanborn map of Bearden's family's house. This is their house at 401 South Graham Street. This is their store, and Henry Kennedy owned these two houses as well. This is the elevated trestle that went by their house, and this is the main line for the Southern Railway. If you stand there today, there's an empty lot in the shadow of the Carolina Panthers football stadium. The Southern Railway main line is close and visible from the porch. The good trains ran in front of the house that faced the main line tracks. Would be here. Bearden explained, quote, "There were no bad trains, but everybody used to think of passenger expresses as good trains. You could not only tell what train it was, but who the engineers were by the sound of the whistle." In his framing, elevated trains always run in the top half, usually over here, but in this one it's here. The house resembles the Kennedys' Victorian home, which was quite fancy. And Magnolia Cotton Mill, which was across the street from them, is in the upper left. Amid the modernity that the trains bring, Bearden includes the domesticity of the yard, the morning glories, the ubiquitous rooster, there he is, and the cast iron kettle in which women washed clothes and made soap. Lest the viewer get too carried away by autobiographical readings, which this certainly has some, Bearden embeds an homage to Cézanne, one of his inspiration. The Piedmont Hills, visible from Graham Street, have become Mont Saint-Victoire, which Cézanne painted countless times from his own rustic studio in Aix-en-Provence. Bearden is telling us, as Cézanne did, that you can stand in your front yard and see the world. Just as Cézanne painted Mont Saint-Victoire repeatedly, in hundreds of Bearden's works, trains run along these tracks in the sky, some perfectly capturing his childhood view of the elevated trestle. Sorting out the autobiographical, using Bearden's art as an archive presents challenges. Bearden's work has become a feast for art historians who have interpreted his personal history from his art, discussing his, quote, rural Southern roots. They imagine, for example, from works such as this, that his urban Victorian home was a cabin. Some say that he depicts the blues and shouts that he heard growing up in the Southern Baptist Church, when in fact his father played subdued hymns in the Episcopal Church. Many argue that the ubiquitous trains are metaphors for the Underground Railway and the Great Migration, and they are. Those trains may be metaphorical, and at the same time, they are real. Nevertheless, Bearden's art is not an archive, of his life. It's sometimes autobiographical, it's always metaphorical. He regularly insisted, quote, "My concern is with universals." For example, here, Bearden built the family around a central figure as immobile as a rock. She sits with legs apart at a table that might be her lap, balancing her cooking task in front of her. The tasks are complex. She is cutting the head off of a chicken or a duck, something that children have watched in horror for generations. A red flour sifter sits ready to sprinkle the pieces, perhaps with that Martha White self-rising flour. A green mug stands to hold the feathers. Another figure hovers to the right, perhaps the matriarch's mother. She is the past. She can't be left behind. Her hand is enormous, weighing down her daughter with history as she caresses her shoulder. Bearden said, "I want to express the handness of hands," by which I think he meant their capabilities, their importance in our lives. He thought with his hands. He said, whatever intelligence you get goes to your hand. His themes here are universals, not autobiographical, from quotidian Southern experiences to the Madonna and Child to his citation of Rembrandt's Susanna in the Bath. As a historian, I honor Bearden's wispy memory, but I also want to know things that he could not. Severed from his family's past, he sometimes built a mythical past for himself in interviews, and he never objected to reading about his rural, Southern, poor roots. In the 1970s and 80s, he rarely disputed the generic tale of his lack of formal training. Self-taught rural poor artist. Despite 2 years of fine arts training at Boston University and 18 months of intensive study with George Grossi, an internationally known Dadaist. When Bearden's narrative transformed into that of a poor Southern black primitive artist made good, his galleries used that profile to sell his work to wealthy white Southerners who had run his family out of town. Some 150 years of historical neglect, family secrets, geographical ruptures, and white supremacist archives robbed Bearden of most of his family's past. Henry Kennedy, Romary's great-grandfather, understood that those histories could not exist in archives. Sometime after 1900, he commissioned a stone to be set in Charlotte's segregated Pinewood Cemetery with 2 inscriptions. Charles Oates died April 22, 1832, father. And Geraldine Oates died January 22, 1864, mother. Charles and Geraldine Oates' actual grave sites remain unknown. Only Kennedy's commemoration testifies to their existence. In so cryptically marking his heritage, however, Kennedy partially obscured it. Charles Oates' father died 32 years before Geraldine did and 13 years before Henry was born. He probably was her father, not her husband, therefore Henry's grandfather. There are at least 2 possibilities to explain how Henry knew Charles's specific date of death. Either Geraldine Oates gave Henry a family Bible in which she recorded that date of death, or she told him his grandfather's name and Henry visited his grave and saw his headstone. If the latter is true, Charles Oates was probably a white man. The genealogical stakes for descendants of enslaved African Americans differ entirely for those of descendants of whites. Finding African American ancestors is rectifying theft, learning about the nature of slavery and resistance, recovering identity, and sometimes recognizing an erased interracial past. Thus, Henry Kennedy put up a monument, a material reminder of the homeland of his imagination. In turn, Bearden materialized stories of slavery and emancipation that defined the Kennedys' lives in works like Conjunction. Conjunction represents exchange among people with African and American past. Here, Africa is close, extending his hand, yet backed up by whiteness, erasing his history. 3 men talk, hovering somewhere between slavery and freedom. The figure in African dress shakes hands with the man on the left, who is wearing pinstripes, vest, and coat, spanning American and African culture. But the middle figure is underdressed, suggesting that he is enslaved. His shirt is the color of the background, rendering him naked. He's decapitated by a white line. His hand makes a futile gesture. His trousers could be slave pantaloons. He is a man uncovered and helpless. He's blocked out of the exchange. The man on the left, Bearden depicts his great-grandfather Henry Kennedy's past. Enslavement and urban life, middle-class culture, and yet Africa so close you could touch it. Conjunction renders experience more clearly than all of the census forms, wills, and city directories in which his family appear in all of those archives that Bearden never saw. Bearden revels in the unknown and makes it legible. Nonetheless, the historian can add some facts to conjunction. We start with the fact that Bearden knew. His great-grandfather, Henry Kennedy, told him he was from Chester, South Carolina. To find Charles Oates, whose existence Henry inscribed in stone as father, probably his grandfather, dead by 1832, you must start with all the white people named Oates near Chester. Then you consult their slave schedules and all of their wills with the faint hope that they might have mentioned a slave by first name. The only record of Charles Oates exists on a marker in a place that he never visited. It is here that the historian ventures into more abstract territory where the faults of disjuncture await. Charles Oates may have been enslaved to a Scots-Irishman named John F. Oates, a Chester plantation owner. The slave owner himself lived across the North Carolina state line with a large family of mulatto slaves. If Geraldine was Charles Oates' daughter, or even if she was his young wife, she must have been sold after his death to a family named Kennedy in nearby Chester, from whom Henry took his last name and where he was born in 1845. Among the Kennedys in Chester, there is only one, the most powerful man in town, who owned a mulatto male slave who was born in 1845. Major John Kennedy, born in 1770 in County Antrim, Ireland, moved to South Carolina just after the American Revolution. Known as the father of Chesterville, John was a covenanted Presbyterian who escaped British pressure to join the Church of England, Ireland, which is the Church of England. In Chester, he founded the Purity Presbyterian Church. Major John Kennedy ran a hotel, operated an adjoining grog shop, and served as sheriff. They called him Major because he raised a company of soldiers for the Mexican War, but they never left Chester. Major Kennedy remains a legend. Generous, impulsive, full of genial humor. Kennedy was a quick Irish wit and full of jokes. At 75, he could jump over a cane that he held out in front of him with both feet. At 90, he could leap up and click his heels in the air. It is also possible that at 75 he fathered Henry, since the boy was the only mulatto slave among 16 people whom he owned, and also since they look just alike. Of course, you can't tell. However, given the Major's age, Henry's father may have been the Major's son, George, who ran his father's hotel in 1850, where George had a free mulatto male servant, 12 slaves, including 3 black women in their 20s and 30s. By 1850, however, 5-year-old Henry lived with Major John Kennedy. Until shortly after his 15th birthday in 1860, he remained the only mulatto slave among 24 people enslaved in the Major's household. Thus, on the eve of the Civil War, 90-year-old John Kennedy, whose wife is recorded in the archives as being a very unhappy woman, actually, found himself living with a 15-year-old mulatto slave, most likely his son or grandson. 2 facts indicate an unusual relationship between Henry and John. First, Henry was literate upon emancipation, and it was a crime to teach a slave to read and write. Second, John evacuated Henry from South Carolina to Augusta after the 1861 attack on Fort Sumter. One clue, Presbyterianism, links the tracks between Chester and Augusta. The major certainly knew Augusta's up-and-coming Presbyterian minister, Joseph Ruggles Williams, father of the future president. In 1861, Major Kennedy either hired out or sold outright 16-year-old Henry to the pro-slavery minister as a house servant when future President Thomas Woodrow Wilson was 5 years old. Henry stayed in touch with his mother, Geraldine. He knew the exact day of her death in 1863. Perhaps she was sold to the Wilsons as well. This is Woodrow Wilson wearing Romary's dress, apparently. Unlike the tangle of memories that Romare Bearden could not unravel, Thomas Woodrow Wilson's family's every move is documented. Tommy Wilson, born December 28, 1856, declared that his earliest memory was hearing that Abraham Lincoln won the election and there would be war. Excuse me. But that might be apocryphal, something that Tommy later dreamt up to befit the lost cause-inflected mythical childhood of a future president. Certainly, among Tommy's Woodrow's earliest memories would have been Henry Kennedy's arrival in the household a year later. He must also have remembered Henry's wedding in 1863 to Rosa Catherine Gosprey, also a servant, quotes, to the Wilsons. As enslaved people, their marriage meant nothing in the eyes of the law. This is Rosa. Rosa Gosprey's family fits even more awkwardly into the white supremacist frame than does the Kennedys. Rosa was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1844. Her father was Francis Gosprey, a white man of Portuguese descent, born in Pennsylvania in 1799. A successful carpenter and joiner in 1840, he lived with his white wife, daughter, 10 other white people, a free, quote, free colored man, 2 enslaved women, and 3 enslaved children. Elizabeth, Rosa's mother, and Bearden's great-great-grandmother, was not yet 23. Gosprey seems to have claimed paternity of his enslaved children. In official records, even the earliest, Rosa and her siblings clearly state that their father is white and Portuguese. Families like Rosa Gosprey's, enslaved, mixed-race people living with white families, were not terribly rare in the urban South, but their ability to occupy a third space between black and white shrank considerably in the 1840s and 1850s, particularly in low country South Carolina, with a majority black population. The planter-dominated legislature, threatened by abolition and slave revolts, sharpened its legal tools. For example, in 1841, the legislature made it illegal for a white person and a black person to look out of the same window at the same time. In 1844, they banned white people and black people from playing games together. Both laws speak to whites' efforts to sustain slavery, but they also speak to fear. There were enough black and white people looking out of windows at the same time and playing games together that it required the legislature to pass a law against it. Elizabeth Gosprey had 8 children with Francis and remained enslaved to him until 1860 when he died of, quote, country fever. She and her family were either sold to strangers or enslaved to a white relative of the Gospreys. After the Civil War broke out, the slaveholders headed away from Charleston for Augusta, taking enslaved Elizabeth and Rosa with them. Within 3 years, Rosa married Henry Kennedy. On August 16, 1866, Henry and Rosa probably joined the hundreds of black Augustans who heard abolitionist Henry M. Turner, a former Union chaplain, tell them, "This is our day of gratitude for the privilege of being able to meet as other people do. As Black Augustans celebrated emancipation with frequent meetings and parades, whites condemned, quote, juvenile darkies and idle Negroes who crowded the streets. History is silent on how the Wilson family reacted to the events unfolding around them. However, when Woodrow Wilson became president in 1912, he famously hosted a White House screening of The Birth of a Nation, replete with street scenes that recalled white Augustans' outrage at Black freedom. That day, Henry Turner gave thanks for 3 blessings of emancipation that affected the Kennedys directly: the destruction of slavery, the freedom of matrimony, and the freedom of labor. Henry and Rosa took advantage of all of those blessings. The couple gave their only child, a daughter born in 1865, her mother's name, Rosa Catherine Kennedy, calling her Catty, signifying the importance of the connection to the past for them. Henry exercised his freedom of labor by running an ice cream parlor. He and Rosa lived with her dressmaker sister Anna and brother-in-law Peter Smith, who worked at a drugstore. Sometime before 1872, Kennedy's literacy and community standing secured for him a job, probably the best job a Black man could get in the South after 1870, as a Federal Railway mail service employee, working on the train between Charlotte and Augusta. Black and white men worked together, sorting the mail on rail cars. In 1877, Henry earned $900 that year, and he moved his family to Charlotte. There they bought a mortgage-free, solid Victorian home in a downtown neighborhood haphazardly segregated on a block-by-block basis. Elizabeth Gosprey, Rosa's mother, came with them. In the parlor, they displayed their only tangible legacy from the Wilsons, Joseph Wilson's favorite armchair. Henry bought a horse and carriage and operated a hack service in his free time. He and Rosa ran a grocery store beside their house and took in boarders. In 1883, Henry's railway salary increased to $1,000 per year. The family's other interests, the boarders, the cab, the grocery store, probably brought their income to about $2,000 annually, which was about that of a middle manager white man and 3 times that of white public school teachers. Kennedy retired from the railroad at 50 in the 1890s and turned his attention to driving his cab and running his grocery store. Rosa Kennedy headed the Charlotte chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union No. 2, a Black affiliate of the White Women's WCTU. She collaborated with white temperance women domestically in North Carolina and also around the world. Meanwhile, their daughter, Catty, married Richard B. Bearden, another, quote, mulatto man and prosperous harness maker. He died suddenly in 1891, leaving her with 3 children at the ages of 3, 7, and 9. The 3-year-old was Howard Bearden, Romary's father. Bolstered by Richard's savings of $950, the young widow moved back into the Kennedy family compound. Some 80 years later, Romare could still see that place. This is a sketch he drew of it in 1985 for his friend and biographer, Myron Schwartzman. This is the porch. This is the garden, the yard, went around there, the store, and then the 2 rental houses. Here, 2 women stand in the front garden of that home, marked by the rectangular framing that became Bearden's method. This conversation, which Bearden completed in 1981, a decade after conjunction, and it contains many of the same juxtapositions found in conjunction, but conversation depicts women. The telephone line, Magnolia Cotton Mill across Graham Street, the ever-present train mark Charlotte as a new South City. industry, and progress dominate nature. As in conjunction, the women in conversation represent two different worlds. The African-clad woman on the left seems intense, even overpowering, as she pulls herself up to look down intently at her companion. Her turban and cowrie earrings contrast with the bon of the other woman, the white lace at her throat, black velvet lapels, and modest pearl earrings. Yet despite her reticence, the Victorian woman seems to be directing the African woman, pointing her finger. The African woman brings her hand to her mouth as if to silence herself or express shock. The figure on the right, of course, is absolutely Bearden's great-grandmother, Rosa. The adjacent grocery store brought the public and producers right into Kennedy's yard, right into Bearden's view, and the pepper jelly lady was probably among them. Pepper jelly is a hot condiment, African in origin, by way of Charleston. The real pepper jelly lady may have been one of Rosa's Charlestonian relatives, several of whom moved to Charlotte and lived in the neighborhood. Bearden depicts the pepper jelly lady and the ubiquitous urban rooster in the yard beside the grocery store, where she probably sold her wares. The train chugs along. The pepper jelly lady juxtaposes 19th century African American heritage with 20th century black urban life. The combination of tradition and modernity in Bearden's early visual memories seemed fantastical to him when they surfaced only decades later. To the world outside the family compound, this family exemplified black middle-class potential and success. By the 1890s, Charlotte was a fast-growing city where 1 out of 4 people had been enslaved before 1865 and where a black middle class cohered. Black physicians founded segregated Good Samaritan Hospital in 1888, which is pictured here in 1903. At the courthouse pomp, there were 2 gourds, drinking gourds, one for the public and one for the lawyers. The black lawyer drank out of the lawyer's gourd. In 1898, white North Carolina Democrats chafed under a white Republican governor, backed by a coalition of black and white Republicans and white Populist Party voters. African Americans served in the legislature and as local officials across the state as late as 1898. Then Democrats launched a white supremacy campaign that played to the class resentment of poor whites who had broken Democratic ranks for the Populist Party candidate. The self-proclaimed white supremacist argued that middle-class black success personified in the character of, quote, a town Negro wearing glasses would inevitably lead to racial amalgamation. Their pernicious white supremacist folk pornography argued that all black men secretly desired white women. Therefore, black middle-class men would exert their status to marry them. Therefore, a successful, quote, Negro out of his place, a, quote, town Negro with glasses, a state legislator, or Henry Kennedy, inspired the black masses to rape white women. The Democratic Party concocted fake news stories of black men raping white women, drove black men out of office by force, and in 1900 disenfranchised them. Henry Kennedy never voted again. Rosa's WCTU cut ties with their white counterparts. For some years, the family's financial stability and Charlotte's comparatively large black middle class sheltered them from the growing white supremacist storm. Romare's father, Richard Howard Bearden, who is there, grew up with his widowed mother in the Kennedys' home and entered Methodist Bennett College, which was coeducational then, around 1906. Upon graduation in the summer of 1910, 23-year-old Howard joined many black North Carolinians and Pennsylvanians on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He worked as a bellman at this hotel right there, across from the Still Pier in Atlantic City, New Jersey. It's pictured here in 1907. There he met and fell in love with Bessie Bearden. This is Bearden's Aunt Anna, who is Richard's sister. North Carolina native Bessie Johnson Banks moved to Atlantic City when she was 10. She attended high school there, spent a year at the Hartshorn Institute, and graduated from Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute in Petersburg, Virginia. She was working as a cashier at a cafe that summer. Apparently, she told Howard she was 19 and spelled her name Bessye. She was actually 22 and spelled her name Bessi. They married, many women did this. They married in the fall of 1910, moved to Charlotte, lived beside the Kennedy home. Fred Romare Howard Bearden, their son, was born September 2nd, 1911. Romare Bearden recalled that his great-grandfather, quote, had a friend from Joplin, Missouri, named Mr. Fred Romare, and so they named me after him. Now, with this naming practice, Henry Kennedy's archive came full circle. The man who erected a monument to his enslaved mother and grandfather gave his great-grandson a friend's name to link the baby's history to his own. But like so much that Henry Kennedy did, this act of naming tied Romare to his own slave past, even as it underscored its complexities. Paul Fred Romare of Joplin, Missouri was born in 1860. 15 years after Henry's birth and a year, or a matter of months, before he left for Augusta. He knew that Fred Romare as a baby at least, but he must have known better the Missouri man's father, also named Paul Fred Romare, born in Torkov, Sweden. By 1854, the elder Paul Romare worked as a bank clerk in Chester. The white Swede had a son with a black woman named Esther Johnson. So Henry Kennedy knew both Paul Fred Romare's, the Swedish father and his biracial son. And the name that Bearden bore all of his life came from a white Swedish immigrant. Within the family, as in Swedish, it was pronounced Romare. It's a Norman name, Normans who went to Sweden. As a toddler, Romare spent long summer days at his great-grandparents', minded by Lucille Kennedy, 8 years older than Romare, whom the census lists as adopted daughter of the Kennedys. As an adult, Bearden recalled Liza. He sometimes called her Lulu. He couldn't quite get her name. As, quote, a little girl who kind of played with me. He painted her. He mentioned her in several interviews. But history had stolen her identity from him. No one named Liza lived near the Kennedys. Lucille became his Liza. Bearden also remembered a Charlotte neighbor, Maudel Sleet. He told his biographer, Myron Schwartzman, she had a garden, and when I passed, she was always giving me something. She was a very nice lady, a very powerful woman. She symbolized the earth, someone with an intimate relationship to it in many ways, people who can grow things. Before Charlotte entombed itself in pavement and circled that tomb with interstate highways, there was something called the cool of the evening. After supper, but before the dew fell, old women would go to their gardens with hats and hoes and bushel baskets. The moon would rise as the sun was setting, so you could still see to work. It was the bug hour. Most people in southern cities had gardens. Many kept chickens in their yards. Here, Maudel Sleet is wearing men's brogans on her feet, as women did when they worked in the gardens. The midi blouse she wears was fashionable in the 1910s. Her skirt is an apron. White women, recently country come to town, wore sunbonnets in their gardens. Black women wore straw hats. No one mixed this up. Maudel Sleet's hands are enormous, big enough to hoe, to farm, to do a man's work, but men rarely did this men's work. On the farm, cultivation might be a man's job, but it was women, white and black, who kept city gardens. Maudel Sleet is built like a man. She has no airs, no graces, and she doesn't mess with much foolishness. She makes vegetables come out of the earth, and Bearden thought that was magic. Sleet's bushel basket is filled with carrots, tomatoes, cucumbers, those little cucumbers that are sweet. And she stands here in the midst of the abundance she has created with those great big hands. The perspective on Maudel Sleet is always that of a child looking up. There is no record of anyone named Maudel Sleet or any similar name in Charlotte ever. The flowers that bloomed in Bearden's memories transport the viewer to his childhood with the Kennedys. He retained a tangible memory of the tiger lilies that grew around the house. In 1980, he said, quote, "I see the porch. They kind of had a garden that kind of worked its way around the house. There was a tiger lily, and it was just fascinating. I'd look at it every day because of the color and the size of it, and this Sunday, it was gone. My grandfather came and looked at me, and I was looking at it, and the stem was just undulating like a snake, and he said, 'Well, your grandma cut it to put it on her dress to wear to church. But don't worry, you'll see it. The tiger lily will be here again.' The lily would be there, but Romare would not." 1913, 67-year-old Henry Kennedy read of President Thomas Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Shortly afterward, Wilson segregated all federal services and presided over the firing of all black Federal Railway mail clerks, the job that had enabled Henry's success. 5 months later, a mob invaded Good Samaritan Hospital, 2 blocks from the Kennedys' home, seized a man who had shot a policeman the week before, riddled him with bullets on the hospital's front porch. The mayor offered a $1,000 reward to anyone who could identify any one of the 35 murderers, calling it, quote, "the first lynching in Charlotte's history." No one came forward. So a year later, when a white mob mistook Romare Bearden for a little white girl and tried to take him, the Beardens understood the danger they faced. Despite family protestations, Bessie, Howard, and 4-year-old Romare left for Harlem shortly afterward, 1915. The move was a traumatic rupture for them and in Bearden's memory. It created a disjuncture that he drew together in shattered pieces of collage after collage. Historians make arguments, and I've made some here, on the erasure of black families' heritage from the historical record, on white supremacy's protean power to eliminate the black middle class, and on the perseverance over generations of trauma that Southern black refugees took north. History privileges hard evidence, the kind of facts that for African Americans are underrepresented in archives and statistical data. The violence done to black archives forces historians to speculate, leave blank spaces, piece together clues. Today, Romare Bearden is recognized as one of the greatest 20th century American artists. Curator Ruth Fine's major Bearden exhibition of 143 works at the National Gallery of Art in 2003 spawned what has become one of its most popular traveling exhibits. Of the more than 600 Beardens represented in my catalog raisonné, the one I put together, over 90% are identifiable in private collections or museums. Biographies of white artists abound, but no historian has written Bearden's full biography. There's not even a published catalog raisonné. No one, including Bearden, knows much of the history that you have just heard. He lost his past, only to be haunted by ghosts that materialized in his art. There exists, moreover, a breach between historical practice and intergenerational transmission of trauma. Perhaps the Kennedys did think that Bearden was too young to talk about their enslavement. Perhaps they did not want to talk about it themselves. Recalling Ralph Ellison, this individual, unutterable pain is the mystery that gets left out of history. Bearden conveys, this is one of my very favorites, all of that pain and mystery in Sunset Limited. The Madonna and child stand in a landscape of separation, sinking on unsteady ground. The marsh below them resembles a map with bulbous roots and water lilies as land masses interspersed in green and blue seas. The figures are clinging to one another between Africa and America, between the South and the North, isolated on a land bridge in their own middle passage. The domesticity of yard chickens is on the verge of being overwhelmed by cattails and swamp grass. A couple, there's a man's face in here in the actual painting, lie on a picnic blanket. They appear slain. The woman is a literal mulatto, half brown, half white. A knife lies beside her. The dangerous crow has replaced Bearden's signature white gull. The train is stoked. Fire from the engine is showing through. It must leave, but she will never get there on time. We stand at a moment when historians masterfully analyze the ways that systemic racism shapes our economy and political institutions, yet we cannot forget the literal and psychic costs that individuals bore and the crushing interplay between systemic and individual oppression. Here, Bearden portrays all the words that all the historians have written in all of their books about the Middle Passage, slavery, and the Great Migration without one word. Rosa died in 1924. Caddy remarried a Methodist minister and moved to Maryland in 1925, but Henry stayed on, alone, in the family compound until he died in 1932 at 86. In this instance, an archive, the Charlotte City Directory, testifies to the victory of racialized political economy. It lists him as a laborer. Racism's victory would seem complete. Ultimately, however, Kennedy triumphs in memory. 2 years before his own death in 1988, Bearden puzzled. What is it? I'm really trying to remember. The clock has stopped. Now I can never know where the edge of my world can be. If only I could enter that old calendar that opens to an old July and learn what unknowing things know. And then he made this promise to his great-grandfather Henry, so long gone. I will wait here for you and Liza to take me where there are tiger lilies and where I can hear the whistle of night trains. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda. Thank you. That was wonderful. You take some questions?
Sure.
Great.
I'm the only thing standing between you and drinks, though, so.
No. Questions, comments. I have a question.
Yes.
I'm doing a new documentary on Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow.
Yes.
And one of the things I'm interested in is who left in the Great Migration. Because all the people who left weren't all, lower, on the lower socioeconomic rungs, nor were they all the middle class. But one of the big surprises, I think, and Evelyn and I have talked about this many times, is the way the civil rights movement emerged in the South, and there was a black middle class that had been there for a long, long time and didn't leave, right? Like the Kings, for example. So who left? What do we know? What historians have done good, solid work on who left and who stayed?
And it depends on when they left. So we should start with Nell Irvin Painter, my dissertation directors, exodusters, because that's a good first period. In the late 1870s, 1880s, Southern African Americans going west for land, going west for opportunity. The people I write about in Gender and Jim Crow, he had gone to San Francisco to found an AME Zion church congregation. So there's this early group. A lot of those people are rural agriculturalists who have gotten education in Freedmen's Bureau schools, have some college, etc. I think that there's political push at the turn of the century from 1890, starting in Mississippi, ending in Georgia in 1908 with disfranchisement, that sends another group of people, generation people out of slavery, even third-generation people out of slavery, on a great migration north. And I think the people who go first are the college-educated, middle-class people of means. And so I don't date the Great Migration to post-World War I. I think that it really starts 1908, right after they realize what's happening politically, that this is it. And then there's the World War I Great Migration for jobs, and then there's a post-World War I Great Migration for culture and writing and, Chicago for work. So I think you have to take each of those separately and look at the context. And there's wonderful work. I mean, Isabel Wilkerson, fabulous work. Jim Grossman on the migrations. There's less work on families who were on the family fracturing that this did. Some good work in Mississippi, but not so much on the East Coast. There's up south, a lot of things. But I think that the trauma that it caused, and the next lecture we'll talk about how the Beardens found their place in New York and what happened with Romare and everything. And it was tough on some of them, and not tough on Bessie, who takes over the town.
Sure.
So.
But it's fascinating to think about who the middle class that stayed behind.
Yes.
Our stereotype of the Great Migration is that everybody left, but that's just not. It's a ridiculous idea. It's a romantic idea. It's kind of sweet, but it's just not true.
And many of the people who stayed, as you said, were ministers. I would spend the weekend at my retirement conference with Jonathan Holloway and Judy Scales Trenton. Their family is, stayed and became president of Livingstone.
Sure.
So
a lot of doctors and lawyers and dentists stayed, and undertakers, and some left.
Yes, and enclaves of people.
And in terms of dating the Great Migration, I dated 1890, 1900. The Sport of the Gods by Paul Laurence Dunbar was published in 1902, and it's about a man who migrates, right?
That's right. Right.
And there's also the internal movement. I mean, the movement from the country to the city. And
the Richard Wright move.
Yeah. So that's it. Questions, comments? You have to wait for the microphone as we're being recorded.
Hey.
Thank you so much. This is a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
I don't know if you are aware of something that is very recent in the Facebook and all of the media. Is to try to dismantle the concept of white supremacy and all the history that is behind it. And at one point you say something like, the people in the South decided that they would call themselves white supremacists, and they thrive on that. And given what is going on in the country politically, this comparison with America and Germany back in, with the Nazis and all of that stuff, I'd like to have your take on that white supremacy dismantling of the concept.
Okay, this is because I'm on Twitter.
Okay.
I do know about this. So what's happening is that it took us years to call these white people white supremacists. It was such a nasty term, and they wouldn't embrace it. And you couldn't even call them racists, really. So calling them white supremacists was the greatest insult, because they proclaimed that whiteness was supreme. But now people are pushing back because of the supremacist part of the term white supremacist, and saying this just continues the fiction that they were actually supreme. We've used it for at least a generation, 2 generations of scholarship as a slur. And now, it's sort of because people are actually using it in a real sense. Richard Spencer will say it with no irony at all. I'm not a person who believes that the meaning of words, the meaning of monument, the meaning of heritage stays the same. If I was, I couldn't be for taking down Confederate monuments and that sort of thing. So I think it's really interesting. I'm not going to... I'll give you a perfect example. I wrote my dissertation before laptops, before computers, on a smart typewriter thing. And I used the term Afro-American And just as I was ready to hand it in, I was driving down the street and Jesse Jackson was on NPR, and he said, "That's a hairdo," and I had to go home. So I'm down with it. If they want another useful term for white people who lynched, took advantage of, exploited, murdered black people, and kept them separated for 150 years, they can come up with one. That's fine with me. I won't change all my books, though.
This is an art question. I have a friend in North Carolina. She and her husband have a quilt by Romare Bearden. And I'm interested in him as a quilter.
I've never seen a quilt. Maybe they had one maybe Ruth Fiennes had one in the stairway.
These people have in their stairway.
Okay, so by the time we get to the third lecture, he's tactile and he's working with fabric a lot. And a lot of his collages are as if they were quilted because they're using so much fabric, but he's not sewing. He pastes onto this special board that he finally had designed for him. So I think it's a natural, and I think that he did not mean for us to take his collages literally. He meant for them to be representative of universals and to have distortion. So, in effect, they are quilts. I would love to see that. Where are they?
Well, they were in Chapel Hill. Franklin
Okay.
Anderson's is about.
Okay.
I assume they still have it.
I'll find out.
Yeah.
We're trend. Question. Direct traffic.
It was a beautiful lecture, Professor Gilmore. I hope this isn't jumping the gun to the other lectures, but I was curious about, in a way it builds on Evelyn's question. So you've got, he's getting characterized by all of these commentators in the art world as from a background that he's not. And his art is being interpreted literally without a sense of his appeal to the universal, his sense of it as a metaphorical exercise. And his response to that is silence, at least as you characterize it. And it seems like Ralph Ellison's response is radically different. It's to constantly say, this is what I'm doing to explain over and over again, and not let the art actually just kind of speak for itself in the way you describe. So I was curious as to your sense of their divergence on that question, if you think that's an appropriate way to characterize it, and what your sense of the appropriate response should be to a situation like that.
I'm going to say this in general because he lives a very long life, and at certain points, and I know how it feels to live a very long life. You don't fight everything that people have said about you in your life. At certain points in his life, he is not famous. Then he's famous as an abstract expressionist, and then he turns to collage. So I would say that the conversation he has with Ellison and the conversation he has with Albert Murray, who sat with him and talked with him as he was painting, they know him. He sees them as his art whispers. He feels as if he's channeling and they're channeling. He honestly does not think in words. He's not as if he didn't have words. He wrote The Painter's Mind. He wrote this great article in Leonardo, this French art magazine, many, many articles. It's just that he doesn't want to argue with people about what they think about his art. He really always felt like, he says, and I'll quote this later, he said, this is about a channel out of myself to reach other people. And whatever they feel, when I reach them, then that's what it is. He did get mad at the, which I'll talk about at the Charlotte Museum at a certain point, but it didn't last. He apparently, Henry Gates can probably answer that better than I can. He was a lovable guy and just he never wanted to embarrass anybody. You knew him.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, he was sweet, but he was tough.
Yeah.
And he and Ellison and Murray are just three faces of I don't know what the right metaphor. They embodied an aesthetic. They it's like you could say the Ellingtonian, the Ellisonian, and the I don't know how to make an adjective out of the Beardonian or what. With Al Murray very much part and parcel of Ralph Ellison, Ralph Ellison's aesthetic. But they hung out together. They were in the Century Club together. They were best friends, and they wrote and listened to music and painted each other's aesthetic. And if you could add them up as a collective, and they were tough and opinionated, and they didn't romanticize the black experience, not in the way of being an apologist for it. Look at Ellison, how tough he was on black people, and Romare was the same way. I think he looked like Khrushchev. I loved him. He looked like Khrushchev with a head like a basketball, and loved the black tradition. But he loved the sort of that modernist tradition, on the cusp of modernism and postmodernism. And you could see, just like Ellison is, that's where Romare lived, right there.
That's right. And there's they're coming of age in the late 30s, coming back in the 40s after the war, early 50s. That's the moment that made their lives. I think part of the reason that Romare didn't object is he didn't suffer fools. He didn't think it was his job to clear up other people. You can hear him in interviews when he's really being interviewed by someone who's silly. Just sort of, didn't I just tell you that? But,
Mm-hmm. Couple more questions? Yes. Is it Wellington?
Wendell.
Wendell. I know we began with a
My
W.
question plant.
Wendell. Her latest doctoral.
Yes,
student.
just finished his dissertation.
Yeah, give it up.
Give it up. Distinguished. Be at Harvard on a postdoc.
Thank you so much, Professor Gilmore. Thanks for this revival of Bearden's genius. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the imagery of hands and the prominence of hands in his paintings. It strikes me as something that is so multi-layered and complex, and perhaps something that speaks to his own sense of production and his own artistic genius. But I would love if you can expand on that some more, please.
He doesn't do it in painting watercolors. He doesn't do it when he's working with oils. He doesn't do it through the period of abstract expressionism. He begins to do it in collage. And when he first started in collage, he was cutting out features of actual people, and realized, he said, I woke up and realized I could get sued. So he started then going back. Watching him learn collage, it took him about 10 years to really get this and make it distortional. And then he became, 4 or 5 years into that, fixated on the hands, and he signifies through the hands. He tells you, there's one collage, one white hand, one black hand. He tells you what he thinks of these people's intelligence, of what they're doing, of where they're going. He thinks your hands tell your story. And so I don't know, but I think that while he can't do a single face, he doesn't do portraits. One of the few I've seen is in the Hutchins Center. I think he can do whole hands. See, nobody's going to recognize that, and I think he really likes doing that. I think, he says, if you're an artist, all your intelligence goes into your hand. He spent a lot of time looking at his hands, too. That's what he's looking at.
Thank you.
Florence Ladd, who has one of the largest private collections of Romare, Bearden, Sorry.
Oh,
Florence built a wing of her house to house her art collection.
A sequel to the comment on hands, what about the faces? In faces of some of the female figures, there are no features. And I've always wondered about what he intended in that.
you know, a part of it depends on what period of time. In collages, there are no features. A part of it depends on, I think, where he is depicting as he goes through this cycle of memory with the collages, you know, the 20s, Mecklenburg, the Pittsburgh memories. His southern, his Charlotte, Mecklenburg County memories are matriarchal. His Pittsburgh memories are patriarchal. And he makes the men often into kind of avatars, going back to his Cubist kind of, his Cubist training. I would, sometimes he doesn't show features because he wants to show people, I think, being obliterated, depending on the collage, depending on the work, who's standing out, who's forgotten. Over these years, I've come to believe there are no accidents in this. I find it deeper and deeper, and I guess I would have to look at, you know, what you're saying to even hazard a guess, and they're all guesses. But I think he really means something with every single decision he makes, even if he's not going to articulate it into a narrative. And he is going to drop narrative. He tells the narratives by dropping some of the same familiar things into it. The white gull, which he thought he sees as the ancestors from Africa flying over the ship in the Middle Passage and flapping their wings and giving hope to the people who could hear the wings flapping and then coming here to build new life. He has certain tropes that he continues to put in. So I don't know specifically, but I do know that when he does that, it's on purpose, and it often represents power. It represents periods of his life and what he's thinking. He does do a lot of women's faces at times.
How did you...
Can I come home with you?
Oh, Ingrid.
Well, I just want to thank you for both the historical detail that you go into and the artistic detail you go into. There's a way I feel as a person who tries to talk about music that one of the hardest things is connecting the social with the details in the art. And so I just wondered if there are things about the historical craft you learned in terms of taking these details, which sort of add such complexity to our story about what race is in the time period you're talking about, and whether you found some of that training useful as you began to, you know, decode the visual language. Or is that too abstract?
No. I mean, that's the core problem of this book. I am a historian, and I have written books that follow his life without him being in it. His great-grandmother Rosa is in my first book. I write about the black and white women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So I know this place. I know this context. I lived in Charlotte a long time. Bessie Bearden is in my second book, which is about radical black people in the 30s and 40s. So I follow the context, and the Beardens keep popping up as I go along. I was in Charlotte when all the white people discovered Bearden and, you know, started putting up all this stuff and everything. So I was living there. So I sort of went through that and watched this phenomena in the 70s and 80s of him being rediscovered in my hometown and what that meant to that, not hometown, but the town in which I lived my early life, and what that meant to that community. So I had all that context. Then I had this very sketchy family history that is just in bits and pieces. And a lot of interviews with Bearden and a lot of sort of impressionistic portrayals of Bearden. At one, there'll be sort of scattered. Myron Schwartzman did interviews. So putting that all together as a historian is something I can do. What I couldn't do is look. And I'm glad it took me so long to do this. I'm glad I took time out to write the textbook, because I actually learned to look, and I learned to, I'm not right, maybe, but I don't care. Because I know what a bushel basket looks like, and I know. So after working on it for so long, the material culture of it is a material culture that I grew up with. Mm-hmm. The garden, everything. So after all this time of working on his art, I finally have a through line of his artistic practice. So I can look at something and say, well, I think this was done then, and I think it comes around that time, and here's what's happened with his practices, but I'm not an art historian. So that was the harder part. So it's just sheer nerve. But, I've had a lot of Coben and Mercer, and a lot of people have helped me learn to look. So. Well, thank you.
Well, and your book, which we hope you publish soon, will be part of basically probably just another Bearden Renaissance, because Mary Schmidt Campbell announced that at our Black Portraitures 4 conference a couple weeks ago that her book will be out in September. She's been working on a book for 20 years. Wow. So that'll be good. And it's a very different kind of book than your book, of course. But it's great. Let's give it up for Glenda Gilmore. Fabulous lecture.